In March of 1891, in the windswept moorlands of rural Cornwall, England, where granite cliffs met the churning Atlantic and fog rolled through ancient valleys like the breath of something long buried, twin daughters were born to Dr. Edmund Blackwood and his wife Constance in the stone manor house that had sheltered the Blackwood family for 4 generations. The birth itself was unremarkable by the medical standards of the Victorian era, a straightforward delivery, attended by the local midwife, Mrs. Penrose, with Dr. Blackwood himself observing and documenting every detail with the meticulous precision that characterized his medical practice, noting the exact time each daughter emerged into the gaslit bedroom, recording their weights to the nearest ounce, measuring their lengths, documenting the identical placement of birthmarks on their left shoulders. He named them Eleanor and Catherine, and in the leather-bound journal he had begun specifically for their arrival, he wrote in his precise copperplate hand that both girls appeared perfectly healthy, identical in every measurable aspect, breathing normally, responding appropriately to stimuli, exhibiting none of the complications that Victorian medical texts warned could afflict twin births. Dr. Blackwood was a man of science and reason, educated at Edinburgh, respected throughout Cornwall for his modern approaches and his skepticism of the superstitions that still clung to the rocky peninsula like barnacles to a ship's hull, and he approached the documentation of his daughter's development with the same empirical rigor he applied to all his cases. Unaware that the journal he had begun would eventually grow to encompass 6 volumes containing over 800 pages of observations that would challenge everything the medical establishment of his era understood about the boundaries of individual consciousness. In those first months, the twins developed exactly as Victorian medical knowledge predicted identical twins should develop, reaching the expected milestones at appropriate intervals, responding to their mother's voice, focusing their eyes, grasping at offered fingers, sleeping and waking in patterns Dr. Blackwood noted seemed remarkably synchronized, but which he attributed to their shared environment and constitution. The household settled into rhythms around the twins' care, with Constance nursing them both. The governess, Miss Sarah Whitmore, assisting with their daily routines, the cook, Mrs. Davies, preparing the special broths recommended for nursing mothers, and Dr. Blackwood maintaining his medical practice in the village while spending his evenings updating his observations of Eleanor and Catherine in the journal that sat on his desk like any other case study. What none of them could have known, as those first unremarkable months passed in the routine care of 2 healthy infants, was that Dr. Blackwood's meticulous documentation would eventually become one of the most disturbing medical records ever compiled in Victorian England, a chronicle of phenomena that would destroy his reputation, challenge the scientific understanding of human consciousness, and raise questions that remain unanswered more than a century later. The journal's early pages contained nothing to suggest the impossible events that would fill its later volumes, nothing to hint at the boundary violations that would make the Blackwood twins a whispered legend in Cornwall and a case study that the medical establishment would desperately try to forget. But before we dive into this nightmare, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if you're new here and love spine-chilling stories, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to be notified when the next one drops. Now, let's begin. The twins developed through their infancy with the unremarkable progression that Dr. Blackwood had come to expect from his careful observations, learning to sit and then to crawl, babbling their first approximations of words, growing from helpless infants into curious toddlers who explored the nursery and then the wider rooms of the manor house under the watchful supervision of Miss Whitmore and their mother. And Dr. Blackwood continued his documentation with the satisfaction of a scientist observing predicted outcomes, noting in his journal that Eleanor seemed slightly more verbal, while Catherine demonstrated marginally superior physical coordination, minor variations he attributed to the natural individuality that expressed itself even in identical twins. By their second year, the girls had developed distinct personalities, despite their physical indistinguishability, with Eleanor showing a preference for quiet activities and picture books, while Catherine gravitated toward more active play. And the household had learned to tell them apart by these behavioral markers rather than any physical differences, as even the birthmarks on their left shoulders were positioned identically. The spring of 1894 arrived with the usual Cornish temperament of sudden rain squalls alternating with brilliant sunshine, and on the morning of April 23rd, 3 days after the twins' third birthday, an event occurred that Dr. Blackwood would later mark in his journal with a heavy black line and the notation, "First incident of unexplained phenomenon." Catherine had been in the garden with Miss Whitmore, playing near the ornamental pond that Dr. Blackwood's grandfather had commissioned decades earlier, a circular pool, perhaps 15 feet across and 4 feet deep at its center, stocked with golden carp and surrounded by carefully tended roses. Eleanor had remained inside, playing with her wooden blocks in the third-floor nursery under the supervision of Mrs. Davies, who had been sitting by the window with her mending, and according to the cook's subsequent testimony, which Dr. Blackwood recorded within hours of the incident, Eleanor had been playing quietly, stacking and restacking her blocks in contemplative silence, when suddenly, at approximately 10:30 in the morning by the mantel clock, the child had begun screaming with a terror that brought Mrs. Davies immediately to her side. The cook reported that Eleanor was clawing at her own throat, her face contorted in panic, gasping and crying out words that initially made no sense. "The dark water," and "can't breathe," and "so cold," thrashing as if fighting against some invisible force, and Mrs. Davies had been attempting to calm the hysterical child when Miss Whitmore's screams had erupted from the garden below. Catherine had somehow slipped on the pond's wet stone edging and fallen into the water, her heavy pinafore and petticoats pulling her down, and by the time Miss Whitmore had pulled her from the pond, coughing and gasping, perhaps 30 seconds had elapsed since the child had disappeared beneath the surface. What made Dr. Blackwood's hands shake as he wrote his account? That evening was the precision of the timing, confirmed by 3 separate witnesses who had noted the mantel clock and the kitchen clock and Miss Whitmore's own pocket watch, which had fallen into the grass during the rescue. Eleanor had begun screaming about dark water and being unable to breathe at the exact moment, within seconds, that Catherine had gone under the pond's surface. Dr. Blackwood interviewed each witness separately, recorded their testimonies verbatim, and noted the specific language Eleanor had used before anyone in the nursery could possibly have known that Catherine had fallen. The twins had been separated by the entire height of the house, and perhaps 70 yards of horizontal distance, with stone walls and wooden floors and plaster ceilings between them, and yet Eleanor had somehow experienced her sister's terror in the very moment it occurred. In his journal that night, Dr. Blackwood wrote that while the incident was certainly remarkable and disturbing, he could not yet rule out coincidence, perhaps some twin sensitivity he did not fully understand, though even as he wrote the words, he noted that his hand trembled and his rational explanations felt hollow against what he had witnessed. What happened next would make this first incident seem merely like an introduction to something far more impossible. The incident at the pond might have remained an isolated curiosity, an unsettling coincidence that Dr. Blackwood could have rationalized and eventually dismissed, had it not been followed by a succession of similar occurrences that accumulated over the following year with such frequency and precision that even his scientific skepticism began to crumble under the weight of documented evidence. On June 12, 1894, less than 2 months after the pond incident, Catherine burned her hand on the kitchen stove while visiting Mrs. Davies, and Eleanor, who had been in the morning room with her mother reviewing picture books, suddenly cried out and clutched her own hand, claiming it hurt terribly, and when Constance examined the hand, she found no injury. But Eleanor insisted with tears streaming down her face that it was burned badly, and the cook's subsequent report that Catherine had indeed burned herself at that precise moment sent Dr. Blackwood back to his journal with hands that shook as he wrote. 3 weeks later, Eleanor fell from the garden swing and twisted her ankle severely enough that she could not walk, and Catherine, who had been napping in the nursery under Miss Whitmore's supervision, woke screaming that her foot hurt and refused to put weight on her left ankle, despite having no injury whatsoever, limping in sympathy with her sister's genuine trauma. Dr. Blackwood began carrying a pocket watch and recording the exact times of these incidents, interviewing witnesses immediately while memories were fresh, documenting not just the events, but the specific language each twin used, the physical symptoms they displayed, the duration of the sympathetic responses. By autumn of 1894, his journal contained 17 distinct incidents, where one twin had demonstrably experienced or reacted to something happening to the other, despite complete physical separation and no possible means of communication. The Victorian medical establishment had extensive literature on twins, of course, theories about their special bonds and sympathies, observations of their tendency to develop similar mannerisms and preferences, but nothing in the Edinburgh medical texts Dr. Blackwood consulted, nothing in the journals and papers he ordered from London, described anything approaching what he was documenting in his daughters. The incidents were not merely emotional sympathies or vague feelings, but specific, immediate, and verifiable transmissions of sensory experience across physical distance. When Catherine scraped her knee, Eleanor felt the exact location of the pain. When Eleanor was frightened by a sudden thunderclap, Catherine jumped and cried out in fear from 3 rooms away. Most disturbing of all was the incident in December when Catherine, playing in the library, knocked over a vase that shattered loudly, and Eleanor, who was in the completely soundproofed wine cellar with Dr. Blackwood selecting bottles for dinner, suddenly covered her ears and described the sound of breaking glass, specifying that it was Mother's blue vase, the one with the painted flowers, which was precisely what Catherine had broken. Dr. Blackwood found himself caught between 2 irreconcilable positions. His training and his entire understanding of medical science told him that what he was observing was impossible, that individual consciousness was bounded by individual bodies, that sensory experience could not transmit through walls and across distances with no physical medium, and yet his empirical observations, documented with the same rigor he applied to any medical case, told him that something impossible was definitely occurring. He consulted his medical texts again and again, searching for explanations in theories of nervous sympathy, in the latest research on telepathy and thought transference that some fringe researchers were exploring, in anything that might provide a rational framework for the irrational observations accumulating in his journal. By the time the twins reached their 4th birthday in April of 1895, Dr. Blackwood had documented 43 separate incidents, and he had reached a conclusion that terrified him, even as his scientific training demanded he pursue it. He needed to conduct a controlled experiment, to create conditions where coincidence and suggestion could be definitively ruled out, to document this phenomenon with such precision that even the most skeptical physician would be forced to acknowledge that something unprecedented was occurring in his Cornwall manor house. Dr. Blackwood spent 3 sleepless nights in May of 1895 designing what he termed in his journal a systematic protocol for the empirical observation of apparent consciousness transfer between identical twin subjects, and the elaborate methodology he developed reflected both his medical training and his growing conviction that he was documenting something that would fundamentally challenge the boundaries of accepted science. The experiment would require the complete physical separation of Eleanor and Catherine for 7 consecutive days, with each twin confined to a different floor of the manor house under constant supervision by rotating shifts of household staff who would serve as witnesses and documentarians, recording every word spoken, every action taken, every reaction observed by the children throughout the isolation period. Dr. Blackwood spent considerable time training Mrs. Davies, Miss Whitmore, the upstairs maid Margaret, and his wife's lady's companion Mrs. Foster, in the precise observation techniques required, providing each with identical notebooks and explicit instructions to record the exact time by pocket watch of any unusual behavior, any statements the twins made about their sister, any indication whatsoever that one child possessed knowledge she could not possibly have acquired through normal sensory channels. He commissioned the estate carpenter to install additional locks on the doors to ensure no unauthorized contact could occur, arranged for meals to be delivered on strict schedules that would prevent the twins from even glimpsing each other in hallways, and established a rotating watch system so that neither child would be unobserved for even a single minute during the experimental week. Catherine would remain on the third floor in the nursery and adjoining playroom, with access to toys and books and the constant presence of Miss Whitmore and Margaret, while Eleanor would be housed on the first floor in the morning room, which Dr. Blackwood had converted into a temporary living space, complete with a cot, washstand, and similar toys and books to ensure the conditions were as equivalent as possible. The basement and second floor would remain off-limits to both children, creating maximum physical separation within the structure of the house, and Dr. Blackwood himself would maintain a study on the second floor where he would compile the observation reports from all witnesses at the end of each day, cross-referencing times and looking for the correlations he both expected and dreaded to find. He developed standardized forms for the witnesses to complete, with spaces for precise time notation, description of the child's activity immediately prior to any unusual event, exact quotations of any words spoken, and the witness's own assessment of the child's emotional and physical state. Even more significantly, Dr. Blackwood planned deliberate interventions throughout the week, moments when one twin would be exposed to specific stimuli, unique experiences, or distinctive information that she could not possibly communicate to her sister through any conventional means, creating controlled conditions where any transfer of knowledge could be definitively identified as impossible, yet observable. His wife Constance had objected strenuously to the experiment when he first presented the protocol to her, arguing that the children were too young to endure a week of separation from each other, and that he was allowing his scientific obsession to override his paternal responsibilities, and their argument on the evening of May 15th had been the most heated of their marriage, with Constance tearfully insisting that he was treating their daughters as laboratory specimens rather than children, and Dr. Blackwood responding with barely contained frustration that documenting this phenomenon was perhaps the most important medical observation of the century, and that controlled conditions were absolutely essential to establishing credible evidence that the scientific community could not dismiss. The argument had concluded with a cold détente rather than resolution, Constance agreeing not to interfere with the experiment while making clear her disapproval, and Dr. Blackwood proceeding with preparations while privately questioning whether his wife might be correct about his priorities, but unable to turn away from the compulsion to understand what was happening in his own home. On the morning of May 20th, 1895, with all protocols established and all witnesses briefed on their responsibilities, Dr. Blackwood separated his daughters for the first deliberate, controlled observation of a phenomenon that terrified him even as it fascinated his scientific mind, and what would be documented over the following 7 days would prove even more disturbing than the 43 incidents that had preceded this moment. The separation commenced at precisely 8 o'clock on the morning of May the 20th, 1895, and the first 3 days of the experiment produced a cascade of documented incidents that transformed Dr. Blackwood's methodical scientific investigation into something approaching a catalogue of the impossible. Each observation recorded with meticulous precision by witnesses whose own certainty about the nature of reality began to erode under the accumulation of evidence that defied every principle of medical science they understood. On the first day, at 10:47 in the morning, according to Miss Whitmore's pocket watch notation, Catherine was in the third-floor nursery, being read a story from a new book that had arrived that very morning, a tale about a princess and a golden bird that neither twin had encountered before, and Miss Whitmore recorded that Catherine seemed particularly engaged with the story, asking questions about the bird's magical properties and requesting that certain passages be read twice. At 2:15 that same afternoon, when Dr. Blackwood visited Eleanor in the first-floor morning room to conduct what he termed a knowledge assessment interview, he asked her to tell him a story, any story she liked, and Eleanor proceeded to recount with remarkable accuracy the tale of the princess and the golden bird, including specific details about the bird's 3 magical feathers and the princess's journey to the Crystal Mountain, elements that Miss Whitmore confirmed were indeed in the story she had read to Catherine that morning, a story that existed in a single copy that had never left the 3rd floor. Mrs. Foster, who had been supervising Eleanor continuously since the separation began, provided written testimony that no book matching that description had been in the morning room, that Eleanor had not left her sight except for supervised visits to the water closet, and that no one had entered the room who could have conveyed this information. On the 2nd day, Dr. Blackwood implemented his first deliberate intervention, instructing Margaret to show Catherine a series of detailed illustrated cards depicting various animals at exactly 11 o'clock in the morning, cards that Dr. Blackwood had commissioned specifically for this experiment, and that contained unusual hybrid creatures he had sketched himself, including a creature with a lion's body, eagle's wings, and a serpent's tail. Margaret's observation report, filed at the end of the day, noted that Catherine had studied each card carefully and had been particularly fascinated by the hybrid creature, which she called the mixed-up animal. At 3:30 that afternoon, when Eleanor was given paper and coloured pencils and asked to draw whatever she wished, she produced an image that made Mrs. Foster call immediately for Dr. Blackwood, an image that depicted with crude but unmistakable accuracy a creature with a lion's body, wings, and a serpentine tail, an image of something Eleanor could not possibly have seen. The most disturbing incident of the 3rd day occurred at 4:17 in the afternoon, when Miss Whitmore, frustrated with Catherine's restlessness, spoke sharply to the child, saying, "Your constant fidgeting is quite insufferable, Catherine, and if you cannot sit still, you will have no supper this evening." A reprimand that Miss Whitmore immediately regretted and noted in her report as unusually harsh. At precisely 4:19, according to Mrs. Foster's watch notation, Eleanor began to cry and said through her tears, "Miss Whitmore is angry about the fidgeting and says no supper," a statement that sent Mrs. Foster rushing to find Dr. Blackwood, who then conducted separate interviews with both witnesses and confirmed that Eleanor's statement corresponded exactly to words spoken 2 floors above her just 2 minutes earlier. By the end of the 3rd day, Dr. Blackwood's compilation of the witness reports filled 23 pages in his journal, and he wrote in his private notes dated May 22nd that the evidence now accumulated exceeds any possibility of coincidence or suggestion, and I find myself confronted with observations that challenge the fundamental understanding of individual consciousness as a phenomenon bounded by individual physical bodies. The 4th day of the experiment marked a threshold beyond which the phenomenon transformed from impossible knowledge transfer into something that suggested the twins were not truly separate consciousnesses at all. And the first indication of this deeper disturbance occurred at 9:23 in the morning, when Mrs. Foster, sitting with Eleanor in the first-floor morning room, heard the child say, "Catherine thinks the porridge is too hot," at the precise moment that Miss Whitmore, 2 floors above, was blowing on Catherine's breakfast porridge to cool it, an action Miss Whitmore had not announced or discussed, but had simply performed in response to steam rising from the bowl. At 2:47 that afternoon, Dr. Blackwood conducted simultaneous but separate interviews with both twins, positioning himself in the 2nd-floor hallway where he could move quickly between Eleanor's room below and Catherine's room above, asking each child the same question at staggered intervals. And when he asked Eleanor, "What is your favorite color?" she responded, "Green like Catherine's dress." And when he climbed the stairs and asked Catherine, "What is your favorite color?" she responded, "Green like Eleanor says," as though both children were accessing a single answer that existed in some shared space between them. But the phenomenon that truly shattered Dr. Blackwood's remaining scientific composure occurred on the 5th day at 11:15 in the morning, when Margaret reported that Catherine had suddenly begun reciting a nursery rhyme, and at the exact same moment, Mrs. Foster heard Eleanor reciting the same rhyme in perfect synchronization, the two voices speaking identical words in identical rhythm despite 3 floors and multiple walls between them, a phenomenon that continued for a full 2 minutes while the horrified witnesses stood frozen, listening to the impossible chorus of separated children speaking as one. Dr. Blackwood's journal entry for May 24th recorded his growing conviction that he was documenting not merely a transfer of information between 2 individuals, but rather evidence that Eleanor and Catherine were somehow facets of a single consciousness inhabiting 2 distinct physical bodies, a hypothesis so philosophically and scientifically disturbing that he could barely bring himself to write it explicitly, but that seemed increasingly unavoidable given the accumulated evidence. On the 6th day, Dr. Blackwood implemented his most elaborate intervention yet, arranging for Catherine to be taken to the 3rd-floor window where she was shown a deliberately staged scene in the garden below, a scene involving the gardener Mr. Peters performing an unusual sequence of actions that Dr. Blackwood had specifically choreographed, including placing 3 red flower pots in a triangular arrangement, walking backwards around them twice, and then bowing to an invisible audience, a performance so distinctive and absurd that it could not possibly be confused with any normal garden activity. Eleanor remained in the 1st-floor morning room with the curtains deliberately drawn, her back to the windows, engaged in conversation with Mrs. Foster about completely unrelated matters. And yet when Dr. Blackwood asked her 1 hour later to draw a picture of anything she imagined, she produced an image showing a man among 3 red pots arranged in a triangle, and when asked to explain her drawing, she said, "That's Mr. Peters doing his funny backwards dance," describing a scene she could not possibly have witnessed from her shuttered room. The climactic documentation occurred on the 7th and final day of the experiment, May 26, 1895, when Constance Blackwood, increasingly distressed by her daughter's week-long separation and her husband's obsessive documentation, sought counsel from Reverend Thomas Whitley, the local vicar, in a private conversation that occurred in the 3rd-floor nursery at 3:30 in the afternoon, while Catherine played quietly in the corner, too distant and apparently too absorbed in her toys to attend to the adult conversation. Constance confided to Reverend Whitley her fears that her husband had become consumed by an unhealthy obsession, that he was treating their daughters as specimens rather than children, and she used the specific phrase, "I fear Edmund has lost sight of his duties as a father in his pursuit of scientific recognition," words spoken in a lowered voice that Catherine gave no indication of hearing. At 4:15 that same afternoon, Dr. Blackwood visited Eleanor in the morning room for the final interview of the experimental week, and when he asked his daughter if she had anything she wished to tell him, Eleanor looked at him with an expression that Mrs. Foster later described in her testimony as far too knowing for a child of 4 years, and said, "Mamma told the vicar that you forgot about being a papa because you want to be famous for science," a statement that reproduced not merely the content, but virtually the exact phrasing of a conversation that had occurred on a different floor of the house, spoken in confidence between 2 adults, in the presence of a twin who had given no sign of attention, but who had somehow transmitted this private knowledge across the physical barriers that separated her from her sister. The conclusion of the 7-day experiment left Dr. Edmund Blackwood with documentation that he knew would either revolutionize medical understanding of human consciousness or destroy his professional reputation entirely, and within 48 hours of reuniting his daughters, he made the decision that would determine which outcome would prevail, composing on May 28, 1895, a detailed letter to Dr. James Hartford, Senior Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and one of London's most respected authorities on disorders of the nervous system, a letter in which Dr. Blackwood laid out in careful, measured language the phenomenon he had observed and the meticulous documentation he had compiled, knowing that every word must balance scientific precision with the inherent incredulity of his claims. The response arrived 17 days later, a letter that Dr. Blackwood preserved in his records and that revealed both the skepticism and cautious interest that his account had generated, with Dr. Hartford writing that, while the phenomena you describe strain credibility beyond what any rational physician might accept without extraordinary evidence, the reputation you have heretofore maintained and the apparent rigor of your documentation compel me to suggest that either you have been victim of an elaborate deception, or you have observed something that demands investigation by minds less emotionally invested than a father studying his own children. Dr. Hartford's letter proposed the involvement of Dr. Margaret Ashworth, a physician who had studied at the University of Zurich and who had established herself in London as one of the few practitioners specializing in the emerging field of child psychology. A woman whose credentials included publication in the Journal of Mental Science and whose approach combined medical training with the newer psychological theories emanating from the continent, and Dr. Hartford suggested that he and Dr. Ashworth might visit the Blackwood estate in Cornwall to conduct their own independent observation of the twins and examination of Dr. Blackwood's documentation. The arrangements required 6 weeks to finalize, during which time Dr. Blackwood continued his documentation of ongoing incidents between Eleanor and Catherine, incidents that had not ceased with the conclusion of the formal experiment, but rather continued with the same disturbing regularity that had characterized the previous year, and his journal entries from June and early July 1895 recorded 17 separate occurrences of apparently shared consciousness, including an incident on June 14th when both twins simultaneously complained of stomach pain that later proved to correspond with the onset of measles, and another on July 3rd when Eleanor described a dream that Catherine confirmed having experienced in identical detail, a dream featuring a white horse in the orchard, despite the family owning no white horses and the twins having no recent exposure to such an animal, a dream that acquired unsettling significance 2 days later when a white mare escaped from a neighbouring property and was discovered grazing beneath the apple trees on the Blackwood estate. On July 22nd, 1895, Dr. James Hartford and Dr. Margaret Ashworth arrived at the Blackwood estate in a hired carriage from Truro Station, and Dr. Blackwood's journal entry from that evening provided detailed descriptions of both visitors, noting that Dr. Hartford was a man of approximately 55 years with the bearing and confidence of established medical authority, while Dr. Ashworth was younger, perhaps 38, with what Dr. Blackwood described as an intense and analytical manner of observation that suggested she was examining not merely the twins, but the entire household dynamic with equal scrutiny. The initial consultation lasted 3 hours that first evening, during which Dr. Blackwood presented his complete documentation spanning nearly 2 years, allowing both London physicians to review the witness testimonies, the experimental protocols, the timing records, and the accumulated evidence of phenomena that defied conventional medical explanation. And Dr. Blackwood noted in his private journal that Dr. Hartford's expression progressed from polite skepticism through growing interest to what appeared to be genuine disturbance, while Dr. Ashworth asked increasingly penetrating questions about the household's social dynamics, the relationship between the twins, and the possibility of unconscious suggestion or deliberate fraud perpetrated by servants or family members. The most significant moment of that initial consultation occurred when Dr. Ashworth asked to interview Constance Blackwood separately from her husband, a request that Dr. Blackwood granted despite his discomfort with the implied suspicion that family collusion might explain the documented phenomena, and when Dr. Ashworth emerged from that private conversation, she informed both physicians that Mrs. Blackwood had expressed concerns about her husband's obsessive focus on the twins, but had also confirmed multiple incidents she had personally witnessed and that corresponded precisely with the written documentation, adding that Mrs. Blackwood's evident distress and her clear wish that the phenomena would cease suggested she was not a willing participant in any deception. By the conclusion of that first evening, both London physicians agreed to remain at the Blackwood estate for a minimum of 1 week to conduct their own systematic observation of Eleanor and Catherine, and Dr. Hartford stated explicitly in Dr. Blackwood's hearing that we shall approach this investigation with the assumption that fraud, delusion, or suggestion will ultimately explain what you have documented, Dr. Blackwood. But we shall also proceed with protocols rigorous enough that if the phenomena prove genuine, our testimony will carry weight that yours alone, as the children's father, cannot provide. Words that Dr. Blackwood recognized as both professional skepticism and the faint possibility of vindication. The investigation conducted by Dr. Hartford and Dr. Ashworth during the week beginning July 23, 1895, represented the most systematic and rigorous examination of the Blackwood twins that had yet been attempted, and the protocols established by these London physicians reflected both their professional skepticism and their determination that if genuine phenomena existed, the documentation would meet the highest standards of medical evidence. On the morning of July 23rd, Dr. Hartford implemented what he termed a baseline observation protocol, spending 3 hours with each twin separately while maintaining detailed notes on their behavior, speech patterns, vocabulary, and responses to standard developmental assessments. And his records from these initial examinations noted that both Eleanor and Catherine demonstrated age-appropriate cognitive development, normal emotional affect, and no signs of the hysteria or nervous disorders that might suggest psychological disturbance or susceptibility to suggestion. Dr. Ashworth conducted her own parallel assessment focused on the psychological and emotional dimensions of the twins' development, interviewing each child about their understanding of their relationship with one another, their dreams, their fears, and their awareness of the unusual nature of their connection. And her notes recorded that both children spoke about their shared experiences with a matter-of-fact acceptance that suggested they perceived their consciousness sharing as entirely normal, with Catherine stating in response to a question about whether she knew what Eleanor was thinking, "I don't know what she's thinking, I just know what she knows," a distinction that Dr. Ashworth found philosophically significant even as she struggled to understand its precise meaning. The first controlled test occurred on July 24th at 10 o'clock in the morning, when Dr. Hartford separated the twins into different wings of the house, placed Eleanor in the library with Dr. Ashworth as observer, and positioned Catherine in the morning room with Mrs. Foster as witness, while he himself moved between the two locations, and the test involved Dr. Hartford showing Catherine a series of objects that he removed from his medical bag, items including a brass stethoscope, a silver pocket watch, a leather-bound notebook, and a green glass bottle, after which he immediately proceeded to the library and asked Eleanor to describe what her sister had just been shown, and Eleanor proceeded to list all 4 items in the correct order, adding details about the watch being old and ticking very loud, that Catherine had specifically commented upon during the viewing. On July 25th, Dr. Ashworth designed what she called an emotional transference test, asking Catherine to recall and discuss a memory that Dr. Ashworth knew from her earlier interviews would provoke sadness in the child, specifically the death of the family's dog some 6 months earlier. And as Catherine began describing her grief and tears formed in her eyes, Dr. Hartford observed Eleanor in the garden, where she was playing with no apparent awareness of being observed, and at the precise moment Catherine began crying in earnest, Eleanor stopped her play and brought her hands to her face with an expression of sadness, stating to the gardener, Mr. Peters, who happened to be nearby, "Something is making me feel very sad, but I don't know what it is," words that Mr. Peters later confirmed in his written testimony. The most sophisticated test occurred on July 26th, when both London physicians collaborated on what Dr. Bull Hartford's report later described as an examination of sensory transference under controlled conditions, a protocol that involved Catherine being brought to the third-floor nursery, where Dr. Hartford, without warning or explanation, suddenly rang a loud brass bell directly beside her ear, causing the child to startle violently and cry out in surprise and discomfort, while simultaneously Dr. Ashworth observed Eleanor in the first-floor drawing room, where the child was engaged in drawing pictures, and Dr. Ashworth's detailed notes recorded that at the precise moment the bell was rung 2 floors above, Eleanor dropped her pencil, brought both hands to her ears, and said, "That hurt my ears," despite the drawing-room being far enough from the nursery that no sound from the bell could possibly have reached her location, a detail that Dr. Ashworth verified by having the bell rung again while she stood in the drawing-room, and confirmed that no sound penetrated to that distance. By July 28th, 5 days into their investigation, both Dr. Hartford and Dr. Ashworth had accumulated documentation of 12 separate incidents of apparent consciousness sharing between the twins, and Dr. Blackwood's journal entry from that evening recorded a private conversation in which Dr. Hartford admitted, "I came to Cornwall prepared to identify the mechanism of fraud or the source of suggestion that would explain your observations, Edmund, but I find myself instead confronting phenomena that I cannot explain through any medical framework I have been taught, and more disturbing still, I find that the phenomena appear to operate with such consistency that they suggest not aberration, but rather a genuine connection between these children that exists outside our understanding of individual consciousness." Words that represented a professional admission Dr. Hartford would later struggle to defend when the investigation's findings became known to the broader medical establishment. On the morning of July 29th, 1895, Dr. James Hartford announced to Dr. Blackwood that he intended to conduct what he termed a definitive test under conditions that will eliminate any remaining possibility of sensory communication, unconscious cueing, or household collusion. And the protocol he designed represented the most elaborate and rigorous examination yet attempted, requiring the cooperation of individuals outside the Blackwood household and involving a staged event that neither twin could possibly anticipate or have prior knowledge of. The test required 2 days of careful preparation, during which Dr. Hartford travelled to the village of Polruan, approximately 7 miles from the Blackwood estate, and arranged with the local vicar and 3 members of the parish to participate in what he described as a theatrical demonstration for medical purposes, rehearsing with these individuals a specific scenario that incorporated multiple unusual and memorable elements that would be impossible to guess or infer. On the morning of July 31st, at precisely 9 o'clock, Eleanor Blackwood was placed in the library of the family estate under the continuous observation of Dr. Margaret Ashworth, who had been instructed to document every word the child spoke, every expression that crossed her face, and every action she took, while simultaneously Catherine was brought by Dr. Hartford and Mr. Peters the gardener in the family carriage to Polruan, a village the twins had never visited, and whose location had been kept secret from Eleanor. Dr. Hartford's detailed report, preserved in the archives of the Royal College of Physicians, though never officially published, described how at 10:15 Catherine was brought to the churchyard of St. Saviour's Church in Polruan, where the vicar, Reverend Thomas Aldrich, stood beside the church entrance, dressed not in his usual clerical attire, but in a bright red waistcoat that Dr. Hartford had specifically requested, and as Catherine approached, Reverend Aldrich performed the rehearsed scenario, suddenly dropping to one knee and speaking in a loud voice the memorized phrase, "The angels weep for the sparrow that has forgotten how to fly," after which 3 parish members emerged from behind gravestones, each carrying a white parasol despite the cloudless morning sky, and these 3 individuals, 2 women and 1 elderly man, began walking in a circular pattern around Catherine, while humming a specific melody that Dr. Hartford had composed, a tune with no resemblance to any hymn or common song. Catherine watched this bizarre performance with evident confusion and some distress, asking Dr. Hartford why these people were acting so strangely, and the entire scene lasted exactly 4 minutes before Dr. Hartford thanked the participants and returned Catherine to the carriage for the journey back to the estate. During these same 4 minutes, Dr. Ashworth documented that Eleanor, who had been quietly drawing pictures in the library, suddenly stopped her activity at 10:16, stated, "Something strange is happening," and proceeded to describe to Dr. Ashworth a scene that she claimed Catherine was witnessing, a description that included a man in red kneeling by a church, people with white umbrellas even though it's not raining, and a strange song that doesn't sound like music. And when Dr. Ashworth pressed for additional details, Eleanor added that the man said something about angels and a bird that can't fly anymore, a statement so specific and so closely corresponding to the actual phrase spoken by Reverend Aldrich that Dr. Ashworth later wrote in her report that she experienced a sensation of profound disquiet that transcended professional detachment. What made this test definitively significant was not merely that Eleanor had described elements of the scene, but that when Dr. Hartford returned to the estate at 11:30 and interviewed both twins separately, asking each to draw pictures of what they had experienced that morning, both children produced remarkably similar sketches showing a figure in red beside a building with a cross, surrounded by three figures holding objects above their heads, and both children, when asked to hum the tune they had heard, produced the same melody that Dr. Hartford had composed specifically for this test, a melody that Eleanor could not possibly have heard through any conventional means. Dr. Burke Hartford's official report concluded with a statement that represented the most significant professional admission of his career. I have conducted this examination with every safeguard against fraud, suggestion, or coincidence that medical science can devise, and I am forced to conclude that Eleanor and Catherine Blackwood demonstrate a connection of consciousness that exists beyond any physiological mechanism currently understood, a phenomenon that suggests the boundaries we have assumed to exist between individual minds may be, under circumstances we cannot yet explain, far more permeable than our entire framework of medical and psychological science has presumed. On the night of March 14th, 1896, when Eleanor and Catherine Blackwood had reached 5 years and 7 months of age, a new and profoundly more disturbing dimension to their shared consciousness manifested itself, transforming what had been documented as a remarkable connection between two living minds into something that suggested their awareness extended beyond the present moment into events that had not yet occurred. Mrs. Helena Blackwood's diary entry from that night, discovered among the family papers and written in handwriting that showed evident distress through its irregular script and ink blots, recorded that both twins woke screaming at 2:47 in the morning, a precise time, she noted, because the commotion had knocked the mantel clock from her bedside table, and when she and Dr. Blackwood rushed to the nursery, they found both children sitting upright in their separate beds, their faces reflecting identical expressions of terror, and both speaking in unison about the man in the well and the darkness pulling him down, and he's calling for help, but nobody hears him. Dr. Blackwood's medical journal entry from the following morning detailed how he had spent an hour questioning each twin separately about the nightmare, and both children provided identical descriptions of a man with a brown coat and a hat with a torn brim, who had fallen into a stone well, could see the circle of light above him getting smaller, and was screaming words that both Eleanor and Catherine reported as, "God help me, I cannot reach the sides." Details so specific and so consistent between the two accounts that Dr. Blackwood noted his concern that the twins had somehow witnessed an actual event, though he could identify no well on the estate grounds or nearby properties where such an incident might have occurred. What transformed this nightmare from merely another manifestation of the twins' shared consciousness into something far more inexplicable occurred on the afternoon of March 17th, exactly 3 days after the dream, when a travelling merchant named Thomas Wickham, who had been conducting business at the nearby Penrose farm, failed to arrive at his next scheduled stop in the village of Lostwithiel, and a search was organised that evening after his horse and cart were found abandoned on the coastal road approximately 2 miles from the Blackwood estate. The search party, which included Dr. Blackwood and several men from the surrounding farms, discovered Thomas Wickham at approximately 8:30 that evening at the bottom of an abandoned well on a section of moorland that had once been part of a failed mining operation, a well that was unmarked and overgrown with bracken that made it nearly invisible to anyone unfamiliar with the terrain. And when they pulled Wickham from the well using ropes, though he had sustained injuries including a broken leg and severe lacerations, he was alive, having survived his fall approximately 6 hours earlier. What caused Dr. Blackwood to experience what his journal described as a sensation of cold horror that penetrated to my very soul was the moment when Thomas Wickham, still delirious from his ordeal, was brought to the Blackwood house for medical treatment, and Dr. Blackwood observed that the man wore a brown woolen coat and a felt hat with a distinctive tear along the left brim, exactly as his daughters had described 3 days before the incident occurred. And when Wickham had recovered sufficiently to provide an account of his ordeal, he reported that he had fallen into the well at approximately 2:45 in the afternoon while taking a shortcut across the moor, and that during his hours trapped in the darkness, he had repeatedly screamed for help, using the exact words, "God help me, I cannot reach the sides," words that his daughters had reported hearing in their shared nightmare that had occurred 3 days before Wickham had spoken them. Dr. Blackwood's journal entry from March 18th represented a turning point in his documentation. The first time in 5 years of meticulous scientific observation that his writing departed from clinical detachment and expressed something approaching existential dread, and his words conveyed a recognition that what he was observing had crossed a boundary from the merely inexplicable into territory that challenged not just medical understanding, but the very nature of time, causality, and human consciousness itself. For if his daughters had not merely shared awareness with each other across physical space, but had somehow perceived an event that existed only as potential future occurrence, then the implications extended far beyond twin studies into questions about the fundamental structure of reality that no Victorian physician was equipped to contemplate, much less explain. In the 7 months that followed Thomas Wickham's rescue from the abandoned well, Dr. Edmund Blackwood's journals documented no fewer than 17 additional instances in which Eleanor and Catherine experienced shared visions of events that subsequently occurred with disturbing accuracy. And what made these episodes particularly significant was not merely their frequency, but the progressive increase in both specificity and the unsettling nature of what the twins perceived. On April 29, 1896, both children woke speaking of the carriage with the broken wheel and the lady with blood on her face. And 3 days later, Mrs. Pemberton from the neighbouring Truehitt estate suffered exactly such an accident when her carriage wheel collapsed on the coastal road, resulting in facial lacerations that matched the twins' description. On June 12th, the twins began crying about the baby who won't breathe and the mother screaming, and on June 15th, the wife of Michael Stokes, the blacksmith, delivered a stillborn infant under circumstances that the local midwife later described as matching the details the Blackwood twins had reported 3 days prior. On August the 3rd, both Eleanor and Catherine drew pictures of what they described as the storm that breaks the church window, depicting a specific pattern of shattered glass, and on August 7th, a violent thunderstorm struck the region and lightning shattered the eastern window of St. Petrock's Church in a pattern that the vicar, Reverend Alston, confirmed matched the twins' drawings with what he termed impossible precision. Bob Blackwood's documentation during this period began to show signs of a man whose rational worldview was systematically collapsing under the weight of accumulated evidence that contradicted every principle of causality and temporal order that Victorian science held as fundamental, and his journal entries evolved from clinical observation into something approaching philosophical desperation, filled with questions about whether his daughters were somehow perceiving a future that already existed in some form, or whether their visions were somehow causing the events they predicted, a possibility he found even more disturbing than precognition itself. What made the situation increasingly untenable for the Blackwood family was that word of the twins' prophetic episodes had begun to spread throughout the Cornwall countryside, despite the family's attempts at discretion, and the response from their community was not one of scientific curiosity, but rather of superstitious dread that manifested in progressive social isolation. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood's correspondence with her sister in Devon, preserved in the family papers, described how former friends ceased calling at the house, how servants became increasingly difficult to retain, with several departing after witnessing the twins' episodes, and how she herself had overheard whispered conversations in the village that used words like unnatural and touched by darkness when referring to her daughters. The local vicar, Reverend Alston, visited the Blackwood estate on September 23, 1896, and though his stated purpose was pastoral concern, Dr. Blackwood's account of the conversation revealed that the clergyman had come to suggest, as diplomatically as circumstances allowed, that the twins might be suffering from some form of spiritual affliction that required intervention beyond medical science, a suggestion that Dr. Blackwood rejected with what his journal described as barely contained fury at the implication that my daughters were anything other than innocent children afflicted with a phenomenon I cannot explain, but refuse to condemn as evil. Even more disturbing than the community's reaction was the change that Dr. Blackwood began to observe in the twins themselves, for by late 1896, when Eleanor and Catherine were 5 years and 9 months old, they had begun to speak about their visions not with fear or confusion, but with a kind of resigned familiarity, as though perceiving future events had become as natural to them as seeing or hearing, and on one occasion, documented in Dr. Blackwood's journal from October 14th, when he asked Eleanor how she knew that the postman would fall from his bicycle the following day, she replied with a statement that her father found profoundly unsettling. "We just see it, Papa, the way you see what's in front of you, except we see what's coming next." The question that haunted Dr. Blackwood during these months, the question that appeared repeatedly in his private writings with increasing urgency, was whether his daughters represented some new stage in human evolution, some expansion of consciousness that transcended the normal boundaries of perception and time, or whether they were something else entirely, something that his Victorian medical training had no framework to categorize or understand. On the evening of November 8, 1897, when Eleanor and Catherine Blackwood had reached 6 years and 2 months of age, they began manifesting signs of what would prove to be the most significant precognitive episode yet documented in Dr. Edmund Blackwood's increasingly voluminous records, an episode that would not only save lives, but would force the family to confront the terrible question of what responsibility accompanied the twins' inexplicable ability to perceive events before they occurred. The manifestation began not with the usual sudden awakening from shared nightmares, but rather with a progressive behavioral change that Mrs. Helena Blackwood first noted in her diary entry from November 8th, describing how both twins had become unusually agitated throughout the day, repeatedly asking whether the household staff had checked all the lamps and expressing concern about making sure everyone is awake. Statements that initially seemed like ordinary childhood anxiety, until both children began speaking with increasing urgency and specificity about the fire that comes when everyone is sleeping and the smoke that fills the rooms before anyone knows. Dr. Blackwood's medical journal from November the 9th recorded that he had conducted separate interviews with each twin in an attempt to understand the nature of their distress, and both children provided identical descriptions of flames beginning in the place where Mrs. Dalton cooks and spreading up the walls to where the servants sleep above, with Catherine adding the particularly disturbing detail that in their shared vision, nobody wakes up because the smoke comes first and makes them sleep deeper, while Eleanor reported seeing Mr. Hendricks trying to open his door, but he falls down before he can, referring to the elderly groundskeeper who occupied a room directly above the estate's kitchen. What made this episode fundamentally different from the previous precognitive events was its persistence and escalation over multiple days, for unlike the earlier visions which had manifested as single nightmare episodes occurring 3 to 4 days before the predicted events, this vision seemed to intensify with each passing night, and by November 10th, Both twins were refusing to sleep, insisting that they needed to stay awake to warn everyone, and becoming hysterical when their parents attempted to put them to bed. Dr. Blackwood's journal entries from this period revealed a man caught in an impossible ethical dilemma. For while his scientific training made him reluctant to accept that his daughters were genuinely perceiving a future event, his years of documentation had provided overwhelming evidence that their visions preceded actual occurrences with disturbing accuracy, and he found himself confronting the question of whether he bore responsibility for preventing a tragedy that his daughters insisted was coming, but that he could not rationally accept as certain. Mrs. Blackwood's correspondence with her sister from November 11th described the household's growing tension, the servants' awareness that the twins were predicting some disaster involving the kitchen, and her own increasing dread as she watched her daughter's distress intensify while her husband struggled with his crisis of belief, caught between the rationalism that had defined his medical career and the accumulated evidence that his daughters possessed knowledge that transcended normal human perception. The resolution came on the night of November 12th, exactly 4 days after the visions had begun, when both Eleanor and Catherine, who had been sleeping fitfully in their parents' bedroom due to their extreme agitation, began screaming at approximately 1:47 in the morning with such intensity that they woke not only Dr. and Mrs. Blackwood, but several servants in the rooms above, and both children were screaming identical words. "The fire is starting now, Papa. Right now. You have to wake everyone now." Dr. Blackwood's account of what followed, written in his journal with handwriting that showed evident emotional distress, described how he had rushed downstairs still uncertain whether his daughter's hysteria reflected genuine precognition or merely the culmination of days of building anxiety. But when he reached the kitchen, he discovered that an oil lamp on the work table near the cast-iron stove had indeed fallen and shattered, its fuel already igniting the wooden table surface and beginning to spread to the adjacent wall, a fire that had apparently started only moments before and which, had it burned for even another few minutes undetected while the household slept, would have spread to the servants' quarters above and filled those rooms with smoke before anyone woke. The subsequent investigation revealed that the lamp had been left burning by the scullery maid, who had finished her duties late that evening, positioned too close to the edge of the work table where the household cat, who regularly prowled the kitchen at night, had apparently knocked it to the floor, creating exactly the circumstances that would have led to the tragedy the twins had foreseen. And when the fire had been extinguished and the household staff assembled to account for everyone's safety, Mr. Hendricks, the groundskeeper, confirmed that he had been in such deep sleep that even the commotion of fighting the fire had barely roused him, lending credence to Eleanor's vision of him being unable to escape. What made this incident the most significant in Dr. Blackwood's documentation was not merely that it represented the most detailed and sustained precognitive episode yet recorded, but that it marked the moment when the twins' visions had demonstrably prevented a tragedy, rather than merely predicting one, transforming the phenomenon from a matter of scientific curiosity into something that carried profound moral implications. For if Eleanor and Catherine could foresee disasters before they occurred, then their existence raised questions about fate, free will, and the burden of knowledge that Victorian medicine and philosophy were entirely unprepared to address. In the months following the kitchen fire that his daughter's precognitive vision had prevented, Dr. Edmund Blackwood found himself consumed by a conviction that the 6 years of meticulous documentation he had compiled represented not merely a personal record of inexplicable phenomena, but rather a scientific obligation to share evidence that, however incomprehensible, might fundamentally alter medical understanding of human consciousness, twin biology, and the nature of perception itself. And it was this conviction that led him to undertake what would prove to be the most professionally devastating decision of his career. Beginning in January of 1898, Dr. Blackwood devoted 4 months to the preparation of a comprehensive manuscript detailing every documented incident involving Eleanor and Catherine, from the initial pond episode in 1894 through the kitchen fire of November 1897. A document that ultimately encompassed over 200 pages of clinical observations, witness testimonies, experimental protocols, and carefully preserved correspondence from the London physicians who had investigated the twins in 1895. His stated intention, recorded in a letter to his wife's sister, dated February 12, 1898, was to submit this manuscript to the Lancet, Britain's most prestigious medical journal, in the belief that the sheer volume and precision of his documentation would compel serious scientific consideration despite the extraordinary nature of the phenomena described. The manuscript itself, which survives in the Blackwood family archives, represented a masterwork of Victorian medical documentation, complete with detailed charts tracking the timing and nature of each telepathic episode, statistical analyses of the correlation between the twins' visions and subsequent events, testimonials from witnesses including servants, neighbours, and the London specialists, and even samples of the identical drawings the twins had produced during the separation experiments, all presented in the rigorous clinical language of contemporary medical literature. Dr. Blackwood submitted his manuscript, titled Observations on Apparent Non-Local Consciousness Phenomena in Identical Twin Subjects, a 6-year longitudinal study, to the Lancet on May 3, 1898, and the rejection letter he received on June 18, 1898, preserved in his personal papers, represented not merely a professional disappointment, but rather a devastating dismissal that questioned his competence, his methodology, and ultimately his sanity. The rejection, signed by the journal's editor, Dr. Thomas Wackley the Younger, stated in language that barely maintained professional courtesy that the manuscript described phenomena so entirely at variance with established principles of medical science and natural philosophy as to suggest either wholesale fraud, systematic delusion, or a failure of observational rigor so profound as to call into question the author's fitness for medical practice, and recommended that Dr. Blackwood seek consultation regarding his own mental state rather than persisting in claims that damaged the credibility of British medicine. What followed was even more professionally destructive than the rejection itself, for Dr. Blackwood, in his desperation to have his evidence considered, began sending copies of his manuscript to other medical journals, to prominent physicians throughout Britain, and to scientific societies, and each subsequent rejection brought not silent dismissal, but rather increasingly public ridicule. By August of 1898, articles began appearing in medical publications that, while not naming Dr. Blackwood directly, made thinly veiled references to a provincial physician in Cornwall who has apparently succumbed to the superstitious credulity of his rural surroundings, and warned against the dangers of allowing spiritualist fantasies to masquerade as medical observation. Dr. Marcus Pemberton, a physician who had trained alongside Dr. Blackwood at Edinburgh and who received one of the manuscript copies, wrote a particularly devastating letter in September 1898 that was subsequently shared among their former colleagues, stating that Edmund appears to have suffered a complete breakdown of rational faculty, and his obsession with these children has clearly progressed beyond eccentric paternal concern into something approaching folie à deux, though in this case the delusion encompasses an entire family. The destruction of Dr. Blackwood's professional reputation was swift and comprehensive, for by October of 1898 he found that referrals from other physicians had ceased entirely, that his letters to medical colleagues went unanswered, and that his name had become synonymous in medical circles with cautionary tales about the dangers of abandoning scientific rigor. Mrs. Helena Blackwood's correspondence from this period described the family's progressive isolation, not merely from the medical establishment, but from Cornwall society more broadly, as the scandal of Dr. Blackwood's rejected manuscript combined with existing superstitious fears about the twins to create a situation in which the family found themselves increasingly ostracized, and she wrote to her sister in November 1898 that we have become pariahs in our own community, avoided by former friends who seemed to fear that Edmund's supposed delusion might be contagious, or worse, that the twins might turn their uncanny perception upon others. The final, most bitter blow came in December 1898, when Dr. Blackwood received notice that his membership in the Royal College of Physicians had been suspended pending an inquiry into his promotion of unscientific claims detrimental to the reputation of British medicine, an inquiry that he declined to attend, recognizing that no amount of evidence would overcome the established conviction that what he had documented was simply impossible. The years following Dr. Edmund Blackwood's professional disgrace in 1898 marked the beginning of a life trajectory for Eleanor and Catherine that would prove as unusual and isolated as the phenomena that had defined their childhood, a trajectory documented through fragmentary sources, including the private correspondence of their mother Helena, parish records from Cornwall, and the later testimonies of the few individuals who maintained contact with the family during their decades of self-imposed exile from society. The twins continued to manifest their inexplicable connection throughout their adolescence, though the family's withdrawal from public life meant that these incidents went largely undocumented, except in Dr. Blackwood's personal journals, which he maintained with the same meticulous attention to detail until his death in 1921. Journals that recorded how Eleanor and Catherine's shared consciousness persisted and in some ways intensified as they matured, with entries from 1905 describing how the twins, then 14 years old, had developed what their father termed voluntary access to each other's thoughts and perceptions, no longer requiring moments of crisis or strong emotion to trigger their connection. Helena Blackwood's correspondence with her sister during the years 1910 through 1915 painted a picture of young women who had become so profoundly isolated by their abilities and their family's notoriety that they seemed to exist in a world constructed entirely for two, never attending local social functions, never forming friendships outside their immediate family, and apparently never expressing any interest in the courtships or marriages that would have been expected of women of their class and age, with Helena writing in 1912 that Eleanor and Catherine seem so complete in each other's company that they appear to require nothing else, no other companionship, no other intimacy, as though they alone constitute an entire society sufficient unto itself. Parish records indicate that both twins remained resident at the Blackwood estate throughout their adult lives, never marrying despite reportedly receiving several proposals during their early 20s from men either unaware of or undeterred by the family's reputation, proposals that both twins declined with what local accounts described as polite but absolute certainty that marriage was not a life they would pursue. The death of Dr. Edmund Blackwood in 1921 at the age of 64, followed by Helena Blackwood's passing in 1928, left Eleanor and Catherine as the sole occupants of the increasingly deteriorated estate, and the few records from this period suggest that the twins lived in almost complete isolation, employing only a single housekeeper who came twice weekly and who later reported to local authorities that the sisters seemed to communicate as much through silence as through speech, often sitting together for hours without exchanging words, yet appearing to share some ongoing dialogue invisible to outside observation. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 brought brief renewed contact with the outside world, when the twins, then 48 years old, offered their estate as a potential evacuation site for London children, an offer that was declined by authorities who apparently deemed the isolated location unsuitable, though correspondence from the local billeting officer suggested that the twins' reputation may have influenced this decision. The final chapter of Eleanor and Catherine Blackwood's extraordinary lives began in March of 1952, when Eleanor, then 61 years old, suffered a severe stroke while working in the estate's garden, an event that led to her hospitalization at Royal Cornwall Hospital in Truro, while Catherine, who had not been present during the stroke itself, was found by the housekeeper collapsed in the estate's drawing room at almost exactly the same moment, having suffered what attending physicians later described as symptoms consistent with stroke, despite presenting none of the typical physiological indicators. The twins were hospitalized in separate facilities due to bed availability, Eleanor remaining in Truro, while Catherine was transferred to a smaller hospital in Penzance, some 30 miles distant, and it was during their final 6 days of life that the most haunting manifestation of their lifelong connection was documented in hospital records that survive to this day. Nurses attending Eleanor noted that she repeatedly called for Catherine, despite being informed her sister was in another hospital, while Catherine's medical chart contained multiple entries describing how she experienced phantom symptoms corresponding to Eleanor's treatments, crying out in pain when Eleanor received injections in a distant facility, and exhibiting distress at times that corresponded exactly to Eleanor's documented episodes of acute suffering. Eleanor Blackwood died at 3:17 in the morning on March 24, 1952, and her final words, recorded by the night nurse in attendance, were, "Catherine is calling me home now," and exactly 6 hours and 12 minutes later, at 9:29 that same morning, Catherine Blackwood died in Penzance, her last documented statement being, "Eleanor says it's time," a final demonstration of the connection that had defined their entire existence, a connection that persisted literally until, and apparently beyond, the final moment of life itself. The story of Eleanor and Catherine Blackwood might have remained forever buried in the fragmentary records of a disgraced Victorian physician and the fading memories of a small Cornish community, had it not been for a discovery made in September of 2018, when Dr. Sarah Chen, a research historian specializing in Victorian medical practices, encountered Dr. Edmund Blackwood's unpublished manuscript while cataloguing previously unexamined materials in the Cornwall Record Office's extensive archives of 19th-century medical documents, a discovery that would bring this extraordinary case to the attention of modern consciousness researchers and reignite questions about the nature of individual identity, the boundaries of human perception, and the possibility of phenomena that contemporary science still struggles to explain. The manuscript that Dr. Chen discovered, along with 6 additional volumes of Dr. Blackwood's personal journals covering the period from 1894 through 1920, represented the most comprehensive documentation of apparent telepathic phenomena between twins ever recorded, with over 800 individual incidents meticulously described, timed, and corroborated by multiple witnesses, and the precision and scientific rigor of Dr. Blackwood's methodology proved immediately striking to modern researchers who examined the documents, for his experimental protocols anticipated by decades many of the controlled study techniques that would not become standard in parapsychological research until the mid-20th century. Dr. Chen's subsequent article in the Journal of Medical History, published in March 2019, brought the Blackwood case to the attention of contemporary twin researchers and consciousness studies specialists, and what followed was a remarkable convergence of interest from multiple scientific disciplines, each finding in Dr. Blackwood's documentation evidence relevant to their particular field of inquiry. Modern twin studies, which have expanded exponentially since the 1980s, have documented numerous cases of what researchers term twin telepathy, or twin connection, with survey data suggesting that approximately 35% of identical twins report experiencing some form of shared sensation, emotion, or knowledge that cannot be explained through normal sensory channels, though the scientific establishment has historically attributed such reports to coincidence, shared genetics producing similar thought patterns, or the unconscious processing of subtle behavioral cues that twins learn to read in each other through lifelong proximity. However, the Blackwood case presented documentation that appeared to transcend these conventional explanations, for the twins demonstrated their connection under controlled conditions that eliminated the possibility of sensory communication, demonstrated precognitive abilities that no conventional twin study has adequately explained, and maintained their connection across distances and circumstances that precluded any known mechanism of information transfer. Dr. Marcus Pemberton, a neuroscientist at University College London, who specializes in consciousness studies, published an analysis in 2020 arguing that the Blackwood documentation, if accepted as authentic, represents precisely the kind of evidence that should compel serious scientific investigation of what he terms non-local consciousness phenomena. The possibility that individual human consciousness may not be as discretely bounded as conventional neuroscience assumes, and he points to emerging research in quantum biology suggesting that quantum entanglement effects may play a role in neural processing, potentially providing a theoretical framework for understanding how two separate brains might share information through mechanisms that transcend classical physics. Even more provocatively, several researchers have noted that the Blackwood case bears striking similarities to other documented instances of apparent telepathic connection between twins, including the well-known case of the Chaplin twins in Ohio in 1986, who were separated at birth and raised by different families, yet demonstrated remarkably synchronized life events, including marrying men with the same name, naming their sons identically, and suffering the same medical conditions at nearly identical ages. And the Pollock twins in England in the 1950s, who appeared to possess detailed memories of their deceased older sisters' lives despite having been born after those sisters' deaths. What makes the Blackwood case particularly significant for contemporary research is not merely the phenomena documented, but rather the scientific rigor with which they were recorded. For Dr. Edmund Blackwood created precisely the kind of comprehensive, controlled, multiply-witness documentation that modern parapsychology demands but so rarely obtains, and the fact that this documentation was subsequently dismissed, ignored, and nearly lost to history raises disturbing questions about how many other similar cases may have been documented throughout history only to be rejected by scientific establishments unwilling to consider evidence that challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and reality. The implications extend beyond academic interest in unusual phenomena, for if human consciousness can indeed transcend individual physical boundaries under certain circumstances, then our understanding of personal identity, the nature of death, the possibilities of human connection, and the fundamental architecture of reality itself may require radical revision, and the fact that Eleanor and Catherine Blackwood maintained their inexplicable connection literally until their final moments, dying hours apart while calling to each other across the distance separating their hospital beds, suggests that whatever bound their consciousness together was not merely a childhood peculiarity, but rather something fundamental to their existence, something that persisted until, and perhaps beyond, the dissolution of their physical forms. For those interested in exploring more cases of documented phenomena that challenge our understanding of human consciousness and the boundaries of scientific explanation, this channel presents carefully researched historical cases supported by archival evidence and contemporary analysis. So subscribe and enable notifications to continue investigating the mysteries that conventional science has yet to adequately explain.